Kat, it's so great to have you with us. Thank you for being our guest on Just Solutions.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, before we dig into the reality of these ID laws, who is impacted and what you're doing about it, take us back to the impetus for you to get involved in this. Why did this become a project you wanted to devote your time to?
Sure. So, I'll take it back to 1965 when we passed the Incredible Voting Rights Act, which was the sort of capstone, that and the Civil Rights Act of the Civil Rights Movement, and made it possible for all Americans, particularly Americans of color, and Black Americans who were being prevented from voting in pretty much every state, but particularly in a lot of states, to be able to vote. And there were a lot of provisions put into the Voting Rights Act that protected voting until about 2013. And then there were several lawsuits, and there have been several since. A very big one being Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, which really struck a big blow to the Voting Rights Act and to voting rights protections. And one of the things that we saw happen literally within a couple of hours of that decision coming from the Supreme Court was voter ID laws being passed. And from 2013 to the 2016 election, we saw a rapid growth in the number of voter ID laws that were being passed in each state, and thus the number of people who were being eliminated from being able to cast a ballot. And so after the 2016 presidential election, which was the first national election without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act, it was really clear to see the types of impacts that these laws were having. And so it seemed to me like, all right, well, we're trying lawsuits, we're trying legislation. It's really tough to get rid of voter ID laws. Maybe we can help folks get IDs. What I realized right after I did that was that we actually have a massive ID crisis in this country. People need IDs for jobs, for housing, for healthcare, for all sorts of things. And there are over 21 million American adults who don't have that ID. And so now what we do every single day is help people get the ID that they need for just their everyday lives, to be able to escape homelessness, to be able to pull themselves up out of poverty, but then also so that when an election comes, they're able to cast a ballot.
Well, we'll talk about the kinds of government issued IDs that are being required and why it is such a burden for so many people to access them. But in terms of voting, supporters of these expansion of voter ID laws, they say, well, we're all about protecting the integrity of our elections. And of course, an ID is needed to make sure that the appropriate person is casting a ballot. Now, what are your thoughts when that argument is put forward in support of these voter ID requirements?
Well, my thoughts are, every reputable study that has ever been done has shown that there is virtually no voter fraud at the polls. We just don't have people walking up to the polls and saying, my name is Joe Smith, and voting when it's not who they are. It just doesn't happen. I live in California. It is a massive state. It is hugely populated. We do not have voter ID laws, and we don't have a problem with voter fraud. So it's not a security issue. We also have just, hours and hours of tape and quotes and all sorts of things of the very people who say that publicly, privately admitting that the reason that they created voter ID laws was to stop people, particularly people, from voting. So it's a disingenuous argument. And I think at this point, it's so very easy to look at really any reputable information and know that this is not about security.